In the cold expanse of space, aboard the sleek warship Zentrix, Captain Valera stood tall on her command deck. Her sharp violet eyes scanned the holographic display in front of her, watching as her soldiers secured yet another human colony. The Exetherians, her people, were known across galaxies for their advanced technology and unyielding discipline. To them, humans were nothing more than primitive creatures, unworthy of respect or mercy. Valera's slender fingers tapped against the edge of the console as she listened to the reports coming in from the battlefield. Most of the humans had been subdued quickly, but one prisoner remained elusive, a lone survivor who refused to surrender. The footage showed flashes of chaos, a man fighting back with ferocity, his body battered yet unbroken. He moved like a predator, striking down Tytherian soldiers with brutal efficiency before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. "He's dangerous," muttered Commander Zixer, standing beside her, his voice dripped with disdain. "They all are. Savages." Valera didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned closer to the screen, studying the human carefully. He was larger than most of his kind, his muscular frame scarred from countless battles. His dark hair was matted with sweat and blood, but his piercing blue eyes burned with defiance, even as he was dragged into captivity. There was something about him that intrigued her, not fear, but curiosity. What drove this creature to fight so fiercely? Was it survival instinct, hatred, or something else entirely? "Bring him aboard," she ordered finally, her tone calm but firm. "I want to see him myself." Hours later, the prisoner, now identified as Kellen, was thrown into the brig. Shackles bound his wrists and ankles, and a force field hummed ominously around his cell. Despite his injuries, he sat upright, glaring at anyone who dared approach. His chest rose and fell steadily, betraying no sign of weakness. The guards whispered among themselves, calling him a monster. Some claimed he had killed dozens during the raid. Others said he feasted on raw flesh. These rumors spread quickly through the ship, fueling fear and distrust. Valera arrived soon after, stepping into the dimly lit corridor outside the brig. She paused just beyond the force field, observing him silently. Kalen met her gaze without flinching, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, Valera broke the silence. "You fought well," she said coolly, her voice carrying an edge of mockery. "For a savage." Kalen's lips curled into a faint smirk, though it held no humor. "And you talk much," he replied in broken Cytherian, his deep voice rough but steady. "For someone who hides behind walls." Her antennae twitched slightly, an involuntary reaction to insult, but she masked her irritation with practiced ease. "You misunderstand your position," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "You're a prisoner now. Your fate rests in my hands." Kalen leaned forward slightly, his chains clinking softly. "My fate," he echoed, his tone laced with bitterness. "You think chains make me weak. You think pain makes me less dangerous." His words hung heavy in the air, and for a brief moment, Valera felt a flicker of unease. She dismissed it quickly, reminding herself that this human was nothing more than a brute, a relic of a species long past its prime. Yet, despite her convictions, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. As she turned to leave, Kalen called out after her. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, his voice tinged with both warning and sorrow. "One day, you'll see we're not so different." Valera froze mid-step, her antennae stiffening. She wanted to dismiss his words as empty threats, but they lingered in her mind long after she left the brig. Little did she know, those words would haunt her far longer than she could imagine, and change everything she thought she knew about humanity, monsters, and herself. The incident with the coolant spill left an indelible mark on Captain Valera. As the alarms quieted and the corridor cleared, she lingered outside the brig, her violet eyes fixed on Kalen. He had returned to his usual position, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor of his cell, but there was a subtle tension in his posture now, as if he expected punishment for speaking out. For several moments, neither of them moved or spoke. Finally, Valera stepped closer to the force field barrier, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Why did you help?" she asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Kalen raised his head slowly, meeting her gaze without hesitation. His blue eyes were steady, though a flicker of defiance still lingered within them. "You think I wanted her to die?" he replied, his tone measured despite its roughness. "I've seen enough death." Valera's antennae twitched faintly at his words. She had expected arrogance, hostility, anything but this quiet, almost weary resignation. It unsettled her, forcing her to confront the growing contradictions in her perception of him. This man, whom she had labeled a monster, had just risked revealing himself to save one of her crew members. "Why?" "You could have stayed silent," she pressed, her voice sharper now. "No one would have blamed you." Kalen let out a low chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Blame doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is doing what's right, even when it costs you." His answer struck a chord deep within her, stirring emotions she hadn't felt in years. The Exitherian Empire prided itself on logic and efficiency, dismissing concepts like morality as irrelevant. Yet here was a human, a supposed savage, speaking of doing what was right, even at great personal cost. It was maddening, confusing, and strangely admirable all at once. "Do you always act so, noble?" she asked skeptically, folding her arms across her chest. Kalen's expression darkened, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer. Then, in a quieter tone, he said, "Not always, but sometimes you have to choose between being a monster and being something better." Her antennae quivered again, betraying her unease. She turned away briefly, staring down the empty corridor, as if searching for answers in the shadows. When she finally looked back at him, her voice was softer, more hesitant. "You confuse me, human. You fight like a beast, yet you speak like someone else entirely." "That's because I'm not just one thing," Kalen responded evenly. "None of us are. Not humans, not your people. We're all more than the labels others give us." Valera didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him carefully, noting the scars that crisscrossed his forearms and the weariness etched into his face. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder about the life he must have led, the losses he had endured, the battles he had fought. Perhaps he wasn't the mindless brute she had assumed him to be. Over the next few days, Valera found herself returning to the brig more frequently. At first, their conversations were brief and guarded, each testing the other's boundaries. But gradually, they began to open up, sharing fragments of their lives. Kalen spoke of his home world, a place destroyed by Exitherian forces, and of the family he had lost. His words were laced with pain, but also with a resilience that intrigued her. In turn, Valera shared glimpses of her own rigid upbringing within the Empire. She spoke of the pressure to conform, the constant scrutiny from superiors, and the loneliness that came with being different. To her surprise, Kalen listened intently, nodding occasionally as if he understood. One evening, after a particularly long conversation, Valera made a decision. She retrieved a small device from her quarters, an ancient artifact given to her by her late mentor, and brought it to the brig. Handing it to Kalen through the force field, she explained simply, "It contains stories, human stories." Kalen stared at the device in silence before looking up at her, his expression unreadable. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally. "Because I want to understand," she admitted softly. "And maybe you deserve more than judgment." As Kalen accepted the device, a flicker of gratitude passed over his face. For the first time since his capture, he smiled, not bitterly or mockingly, but genuinely. In that moment, Valera realized she had crossed a line she could never uncross. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain: her view of humanity and herself would never be the same again. The night of the escape was filled with tension, every second stretching like an eternity. Valera led Kalen through the dimly lit corridors of the Zentrix, her heart pounding in rhythm with the faint hum of the ship's engines. Behind them, alarms remained eerily silent, thanks to Terra's skillful rerouting of surveillance systems, but they knew it was only a matter of time before their absence was discovered. Kalen moved quickly despite his chains, which had been loosened but not fully removed to avoid suspicion. His sharp eyes scanned their surroundings constantly, alert for any sign of danger. Though he said little, his presence was steady and reassuring, a quiet strength that matched Valera's determination. As they approached the cargo bay, Valera paused at a junction, glancing around cautiously. "We're almost there," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low thrum of machinery. "Just a little further." Kalen nodded, his expression grim but focused. "You don't have to do this," he said suddenly, his tone softer than before. "You can still turn back." Valera turned to face him, her violet eyes blazing with resolve. "I've made my choice," she replied firmly. "There's no going back now, for either of us." They pressed on, reaching the hangar bay moments later. The decommissioned shuttle sat in the corner, its battered exterior blending seamlessly with the clutter of crates and equipment. Terra and 2 other crew members waited nearby, their faces pale but resolute as they finished final preparations. "Everything's ready," Terra reported quietly, handing Valera a small data pad containing navigation coordinates. "Once you're clear of the ship, activate the cloaking device. It won't last long, but it should buy you enough time to get away." Valera accepted the device with a nod, her antennae twitching faintly. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "All of you." Tyra forced a smile, though her hands trembled slightly. "Good luck, Captain. And be careful." With no time to waste, Valera and Kalen boarded the shuttle. As the hatch sealed shut behind them, Valera took her place at the controls, her fingers flying over the console as she powered up the engines. Kalen strapped himself into the co-pilot seat, watching her with a mix of admiration and concern. "You know how to fly one of these?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'll manage," she shot back, her lips curving into a brief smirk. "Besides, it's not like we have a choice." The shuttle lifted off smoothly, its thrusters igniting with a low roar as it ascended toward the hangar doors. Just as they reached the threshold, alarms blared throughout the ship, shattering the fragile silence. Red warning lights flashed across the bay, illuminating the panicked faces of the remaining crew members below. "They know," Kalen muttered, gripping the armrests tightly. "Hold on," Valera shouted, slamming her hand down on the release lever. The hangar doors parted just wide enough for the shuttle to slip through, and she pushed the engines to full throttle, hurtling them out into the vast expanse of space. Behind them, the Zentrix loomed large against the stars, its sleek form marred by flashes of explosions as the Council's enforcers arrived. Laser fire streaked past their shuttle, narrowly missing its hull. Valera activated the cloaking device, enveloping the vessel in a shimmering veil of invisibility. For a moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath. When the danger passed, Kalen let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Well," he said, grinning despite the chaos, "that was fun." Valera couldn't help but chuckle, relief washing over her like a wave. Fun isn't exactly the word I'd use. For several minutes neither spoke, both lost in thought as they gazed out at the endless sea of stars. Then, softly, Kalen broke the silence. "Where do we go from here?" Valera exhaled slowly, her gaze unwavering. "Somewhere far away from the Empire. Somewhere we can start over." "And if they come looking for us?" She glanced at him, her expression fierce yet hopeful. "Then we'll fight, not because we're monsters, but because we're something better." As the shuttle sped onward, leaving the Zentrix and everything familiar behind, Valera felt a spark of freedom ignite within her, a promise of new beginnings, forged in defiance and hope. Whatever lay ahead, she knew they would face it together. The shuttle's engines hummed steadily as it drifted through the void, carrying Valera and Kalen far from the Zentrix and the empire that had shaped their lives. After hours of tense flight, they landed on a remote planet, a desolate yet beautiful world with jagged mountains, sprawling forests, and skies painted in hues of gold and crimson. It was untouched by civilization, offering them both sanctuary and solitude. For the first time in what felt like forever, they stepped out into fresh air, freed from the confines of metal walls and artificial light. The ground beneath their feet was uneven but solid, covered in soft moss that cushioned each step. Kalen took a deep breath, closing his eyes as he savored the unfamiliar scent of wildflowers and damp earth. Valera stood beside him, her antennae twitching slightly as she absorbed the alien landscape. "It's peaceful," she murmured, her voice tinged with wonder. "I've never seen anything like this." Kalen glanced at her, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Welcome to freedom." Their initial days were challenging. With limited supplies salvaged from the shuttle, they worked tirelessly to establish a basic shelter. Kalen proved adept at improvisation, using scraps of metal and tools to construct sturdy walls and a roof. Valera, accustomed to issuing orders rather than manual labor, struggled at first but soon adapted, learning quickly under Kalen's patient guidance. Despite their progress, tensions occasionally flared between them. Valera's logical approach often clashed with Kalen's intuitive methods. When she insisted on calculating precise angles for the shelter structure, he laughed and told her, "Sometimes you just have to trust your gut." Her antennae quivered indignantly, but eventually she conceded, not because she agreed, but because his way worked. One evening, as they sat together outside their makeshift home, Kalen handed her a small device he'd repaired from the shuttle's wreckage. "Thought you might like this," he said simply. It was a music player, loaded with human melodies he'd saved before leaving the ship. Valera hesitated, then pressed play. Soft notes filled the air, gentle rhythms, and haunting harmonies that seemed to echo the vastness of the universe around them. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. For someone raised in the rigid discipline of the Scytherian Empire, where art was considered frivolous, this was an entirely new experience. "What is this?" she asked quietly, opening her eyes to look at him. "Music," Kalen replied, smiling warmly. "It's how we express emotions words can't capture. Joy, sorrow, hope, all of it." Valera nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "It's beautiful." As weeks turned into months, their bond deepened further. They shared stories of their pasts, revealing vulnerabilities they had kept hidden even from themselves. Kalen spoke of his wife and child, lost to Scytherian attacks, his voice raw with grief, but also tinged with gratitude for the life they had given him. In turn, Valera confessed her struggles within the Empire, her fear of failure, her longing for connection, her doubts about the righteousness of their conquests. One night, under a sky ablaze with unfamiliar constellations, Valera turned to Kalen with a question that had been lingering in her mind. "After everything you've endured, the loss, the pain, how do you still find hope?" Kalen gazed up at the stars, his expression contemplative. "Hope isn't something you find," he said finally. "It's something you choose. Even when things seem darkest, you have to believe there's still good left in the universe, even if it's hidden sometimes." His words resonated deeply within her, stirring a resolve she hadn't realized she possessed. For so long, she had lived by the Empire's rules, suppressing her own desires and emotions. But here, in this untamed wilderness, she began to rediscover herself, not as Captain Valera, loyal servant of the Scytherian Empire, but as simply Valera, a being capable of growth, compassion, and change. "You're stronger than you think," Kalen added softly, meeting her gaze. "And I believe in you." Her antennae twitched faintly, and she looked away to hide the flush creeping across her cheeks. Yet, beneath her embarrassment lay a flicker of pride and determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. On the horizon, the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, casting the land in shades of amber and violet. As Valera and Kalen stood side by side, silhouetted against the fading light, they felt a quiet certainty settle over them. This was not the end of their journey. It was only the beginning. Together, they would forge a new path, guided by hope, resilience, and the unshakable belief that even monsters could become heroes. The next few days aboard the Zentrix passed in tense silence for Captain Valera. She found herself drawn back to the brig repeatedly, unable to shake the unsettling feeling Callan had left her with. Each time she visited, he sat quietly in his cell, his piercing blue eyes watching her every move. He rarely spoke unless provoked, and when he did, his words carried a weight that unnerved her. During one such visit, Valera stood just outside the force field barrier, arms crossed as she studied him. "Why do you resist?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm but probing. "Your kind always fights us, even when resistance is futile." "Why?" Callan tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then with deliberate slowness, he said, "Because we have no choice." "No choice," Valera repeated, her antennae twitching faintly. "You could surrender. Submit. Accept your place." His laugh was low and bitter, sending a shiver down her spine despite herself. "Accept our place. And what place is that? To be crushed underfoot by your empire. To watch as you destroy everything we hold dear." Valera frowned, taken aback by the raw emotion in his voice. She had expected anger, defiance, perhaps even hatred, but not this quiet despair. It made her uncomfortable, forcing her to confront emotions she wasn't trained to handle. "You brought this on yourselves," she countered sharply, though her tone lacked its usual conviction. "If your species hadn't resisted progress, maybe things would have been different." "Progress." Kalen spat the word like it was poison. "Is that what you call it? Stealing resources, enslaving worlds, killing anyone who stands in your way. That's not progress, it's greed." Valera opened her mouth to argue but hesitated. Deep down, she knew there was truth in his words. The Exitherian Empire prided itself on its advancements, but those achievements came at a cost, one she had never questioned until now. Still, she couldn't let him see her doubt. Instead, she straightened her posture and glared at him. "You're nothing but a monster," she snapped, more to convince herself than him. "A violent brute who knows nothing of order or discipline." Kalen's gaze softened unexpectedly, almost pityingly. "Maybe I am a monster," he admitted quietly. "But if I am, then what does that make you?" Her antennae quivered again, and she turned away abruptly, ending the conversation before it could go further. Yet, as she walked back to the command deck, his question echoed in her mind. "What does that make you?" Meanwhile, rumors about Kalen continued to spread among the crew. Some claimed he had murdered over 50 Exitherians during the raid, tearing through them with his bare hands. Others whispered that he feasted on their remains, painting a grotesque picture of savagery. These tales grew wilder with each retelling, feeding into the fear already simmering aboard the ship. Commander Zixer seized the opportunity to stoke the flames. During a meeting with Valera, he leaned forward, his sharp teeth gleaming menacingly. "This human is dangerous, Captain," he growled. "He's poisoning morale. If we don't act soon, the crew will lose faith in your leadership." Valera bristled at the insinuation, but forced herself to remain composed. "I'm aware of the situation, Commander," she replied coolly. "There's no need to panic." Zixer sneered. "Panic? No, Captain. But perhaps you're too close to this. Prisoner, you've spent far too much time in the brig. The crew notices these things." His words struck a nerve, and Valera clenched her fists beneath the table. Still, she refused to rise to the bait. "My decisions are my own," she said firmly, "and they will remain so." Despite her outward confidence, doubt gnawed at her. Was Zixer right? Had she grown too sympathetic toward Callan? She resolved to distance herself from him, focusing instead on her duties as captain. Yet, days later, another incident occurred that forced her to reconsider. A young engineer named Tira accidentally spilled coolant fluid near the break while performing maintenance. The liquid pooled dangerously close to an exposed circuit panel, sparking violently. Alarms blared as smoke filled the corridor, and panic erupted among the nearby crew members. In the chaos, no one noticed Kalen pressing his hands against the force field, shouting instructions in broken Xytherian. "Stop leak. Block current." He barked urgently. "Use sealant." Though his grammar was clumsy, his meaning was clear. Following his guidance, the crew managed to contain the spill before it caused serious damage. When medical drones arrived moments later to treat Kara's minor burns, everyone stared at Kalen in stunned silence. For the first time, Valora saw him not as a monster, but as something else entirely. Something unexpected. The growing bond between Captain Valora and Kalen did not go unnoticed aboard the Zentrix. Whispers traveled through the ship's corridors like shadows, carried by curious crew members who had observed their captain spending more time in the brig than was deemed appropriate. Commander Zixer, ever vigilant and opportunistic, wasted no time reporting these developments to the High Council. "They say she visits him daily," Zixer sneered during a secure transmission, his sharp teeth glinting menacingly under the dim lights of his quarters. "She brings him books, shares meals with him, even laughs at his jokes. This is unacceptable behavior for a Xytherian officer." On the other end of the transmission, the council members exchanged uneasy glances. Valora was one of their most decorated captains, but her recent actions threatened the Empire's rigid order. The idea of a Xytherian forming any kind of connection with a human prisoner was unthinkable, a violation of everything they stood for. "The situation must be addressed immediately," declared Elder Trellis, the council's stern leader. "If Captain Valora has grown too sympathetic to the enemy, then she poses a risk to our mission and to our people." Orders were issued swiftly. Kalen was to be executed without delay, and Valora would face questioning regarding her loyalty to the Empire. Enforcers were dispatched to the Zentrix, scheduled to arrive within 3 days. When Valora received the council's decree, her blood ran cold. Standing alone in her quarters, Valora clenched the edges of her desk, her antennae quivering with a mix of anger and fear. She had known her actions might draw suspicion, but she hadn't expected such swift retribution. Her mind raced as she weighed her options. Submitting to the council meant betraying Kellen, the man who had shown her kindness, understanding, and a glimpse of hope beyond the Empire's suffocating rules. Yet defying them could cost her everything: her rank, her freedom, her life. For hours, she paced back and forth, wrestling with her conscience. Finally, exhaustion gave way to resolve. She couldn't abandon Kellen, not after everything they had shared, not when she finally understood what it meant to truly see someone for who they were, rather than what others labeled them. That night, Valora slipped into the engineering bay, seeking out Tara, the young engineer Kellen had helped save during the coolant spill. Though hesitant at first, Tara agreed to assist once Valora explained the gravity of the situation. Together, they devised a risky plan to smuggle Kellen off the ship using a decommissioned supply shuttle hidden in the cargo bay. "You realize this will make you a traitor, don't you?" Tara asked quietly, her wide eyes filled with concern. "I already am," Valora replied, her voice steady despite the weight of her decision. "But some things are worth betraying for." Over the next 2 days, preparations moved forward in secret. Valora disabled key security systems, while Tira rerouted surveillance feeds to create blind spots throughout the ship. A few trusted crew members, inspired by whispers of Valora's rebellion, volunteered to help, risking their own lives to ensure Kellen's escape. On the eve of the enforcer's arrival, Valora visited Kellen one last time. He looked up as she approached, sensing the tension radiating from her. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. "They're coming for you," she admitted, her tone urgent. "They want to execute you tomorrow." Kalen's jaw tightened, but he nodded grimly. "I figured as much." "There's a way out," she continued quickly. A shuttle. We can get you off the ship before they arrive." He studied her carefully, his piercing blue eyes searching hers. "And what about you? What happens to you if you help me?" Valera hesitated, then straightened her posture, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "I'm done hiding behind duty and fear. If I stay here, I'll lose myself completely. I'd rather face whatever comes next with someone who sees me for who I really am." Kalen stared at her for a long moment, then smiled faintly, a gesture of gratitude and respect. "All right," he said simply. "Let's do this." As the final pieces of the plan fell into place, Valera felt a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. For the first time in her life, she was stepping into the unknown, guided not by orders or expectations, but by trust and hope. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. Months passed on the remote planet, and Valera and Callan's life settled into a rhythm of survival and discovery. They had built a sturdy shelter, cultivated food using hydroponic techniques salvaged from the shuttle, and even managed to repair some communication equipment. Though their days were filled with hard work, there was an undeniable sense of peace in their new existence, a stark contrast to the rigid discipline and constant tension of the Zentrix. One evening, as they sat together inside their shelter, Valera intercepted a faint transmission crackling through the repaired comms device. At first, it was garbled and fragmented, but after adjusting the frequency, she recognized the unmistakable tones of Etherian speech. Her antennae twitched sharply as she listened intently, her expression growing darker with each passing moment. "They branded me a traitor," she said finally, her voice low and bitter. "The Council is offering rewards for my capture, and yours." Kalen leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What else does it say?" Valera hesitated before continuing. "There's unrest among the lower ranks of the Empire. Some citizens are questioning the Council's decisions, inspired by rumors of our escape. It seems not everyone agrees with their methods anymore." A flicker of hope sparked in Callan's eyes. "Maybe this is our chance," he said slowly. "If people are starting to doubt the Empire, maybe we can help them see another way." Valera stared at him, her mind racing. The idea of returning to space, to confront the very system that had shaped her entire life, was terrifying. Yet deep down, she knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. If there was a chance to inspire change, to challenge the corruption and cruelty of the Empire, then they had a responsibility to act. "We'll need more than hope," she said firmly. "We'll need a plan." Over the next few weeks, they prepared meticulously. Using parts scavenged from the shuttle and materials found on the planet, they upgraded their vessel, outfitting it with enhanced shields and cloaking technology. Valera worked tirelessly, channeling her guilt and anger into every weld and circuit. Kalen, meanwhile, focused on gathering intelligence, intercepting transmissions to learn about the Empire's movements and vulnerabilities. When the repairs were complete, they stood together outside the shuttle, gazing up at the stars. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of what lay ahead pressing heavily on their shoulders. "You don't have to come with me," Valera said finally, breaking the silence. "You've already risked so much." Kalen shook his head, his expression resolute. "I'm not letting you face this alone. Besides, humanity needs someone willing to fight for them. And so do you." Her antennae quivered faintly, and she looked away briefly, touched by his unwavering support. "Thank you," she murmured softly. As the shuttle lifted off, leaving the planet behind, Valera felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about rebellion. It was about redemption, for herself, for Kalen, and for all those who had suffered under the Empire's tyranny. Together, they would expose the truth, rallying others to join their cause. Their journey was fraught with danger. They evaded patrols, hacked secure networks, and broadcast messages of defiance across the galaxy. Each step was perilous, but with every success, their movement grew stronger. Dissidents within the Empire reached out, sharing stories of oppression and pledging their allegiance to the fledgling resistance. In time, Valera and Callan became symbols of hope, not just for humans, but for any species burdened by the Empire's greed and cruelty. Their bond, forged in adversity, became a beacon of unity, proving that even the most unlikely alliances could spark profound change. As they approached the heart of the Empire, ready to face whatever awaited them, Valera glanced at Callan, her violet eyes steady. "Whatever happens next," she said, her voice firm yet warm, "we'll face it together." He smiled faintly, nodding in agreement. Together. The shuttle surged forward, disappearing into the vast expanse of space. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. A future where monsters and heroes were no longer defined by fear or prejudice, but by the courage to choose something better. And in that choice, they found their greatest strength. As days turned into weeks, the dynamic between Captain Valera and Callan shifted in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The small device she had given him, a repository of human stories, became a bridge between two vastly different worlds. Each evening after her duties were done, Valera would visit the brig, sitting just outside the force field as Callan recounted tales from the archive. Some were tragic, others hopeful, but all carried threads of humanity's resilience and creativity. One night, Callan shared a story about forgiveness, a concept foreign to Valera's militaristic upbringing. In the tale, a wronged individual chose not to seek revenge, but instead extended compassion to their oppressor. Valera listened intently, her antennae twitching faintly as she processed the idea. When he finished, she leaned forward slightly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Why would anyone do that?" she asked. "To forgive someone who has harmed you, isn't that weakness?" Callan shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "Not weakness," he corrected gently. "Strength. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what happened. It means choosing peace over hate, even when it's hard." Valera frowned, her mind racing. The Exitherian Empire valued strength above all else, equating vulnerability with failure. Yet here was Callan, a man who had endured unimaginable loss, advocating for something so illogical. And yet, it resonated with her in a way she couldn't fully explain. "Peace sounds nice," she admitted hesitantly. "But how can you trust someone who hurt you? How can you let go of anger?" He smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "You don't forget the pain. But holding on to anger only keeps you trapped in it. Sometimes, letting go is the only way to move forward." Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, almost reluctantly, she began to share pieces of her own life. Stories of growing up under the Empire's strict hierarchy, where emotions were suppressed and empathy was seen as a flaw. She spoke of the pressure to conform, the fear of making mistakes, and the isolation that came with being a leader. Callan listened without judgment, nodding occasionally as if to encourage her to continue. "You're stronger than you think," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "It takes courage to question what you've always been told." Valera looked at him sharply, surprised by his words. "Courage," she echoed. "I'm just doing my duty." "No," he countered firmly. "Duty is following orders blindly. What you're doing, questioning, listening, that's something else entirely." His affirmation stirred something deep within her, a flicker of pride mixed with uncertainty. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond the rigid confines of the Empire, a future where she wasn't bound by its rules and expectations. But such thoughts were dangerous, and she quickly pushed them aside. Their bond continued to grow, built on shared moments of vulnerability and understanding. One day, during one of their conversations, Callan asked a question that caught her off guard. "Do you ever wonder what lies beyond the stars, beyond your empire's reach?" Valera hesitated, caught between curiosity and caution. "The unknown scares us," she admitted quietly. "We cling to what we know because it feels safe." "But safety doesn't always mean freedom," Callan replied, his tone gentle but firm. Sometimes you have to take risks to find something better. His words lingered in her mind long after their conversation ended. That night, as she lay in her quarters, staring at the ceiling, she found herself wondering, what if he's right? What if there was more to life than duty and obedience? What if the universe held possibilities she had never dared to dream of? The next morning, Valra returned to the brig with a stack of books from the ship's library, texts on art, philosophy, and history. She handed them to Callan through the force field, explaining simply, if I'm going to understand humanity, I need to learn more. Callan accepted the books with a grateful smile, his eyes lighting up in a way she hadn't seen before. Thank you, he said softly, for seeing me, not as a monster, but as a person. Her antennae quivered faintly, and she turned away to hide the flush creeping across her cheeks. Don't thank me yet, she muttered. This doesn't change anything. But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. Something had changed, something profound. Whether she liked it or not, Callan had become more than a prisoner. He was a friend, a teacher, and perhaps something more.